Then I'll let you know when we are streaming live. Almost there. All right, we are now streaming live.
Okay. Pursuant to recently adopted amendments to Illinois Open Meetings Act included in Public Act 1010640, public bodies may, in certain circumstances, hold entirely virtual public meetings without a quorum physically present in any one location. Governor Pritzker's Executive Order 2022-01 has extended this provision through February 6th, 2022. As chair of the Finance Committee, I have made the determination that it is not practical nor prudent to meet in person at this time. Accordingly, this meeting of the Finance Committee is being conducted virtually with all members of the committee, village board, and staff participating through the Zoom webinar platform. Village Manager Phil Corrali is in the Village Hall conference room in compliance with the Open Meetings Act. Can I have a roll call, please?
Trustee Vree.
Here.
Trustee Hallwax.
Here.
Trustee Rubin.
Here.
We have quorum.
As noted, today's Finance Committee meeting is being conducted as a virtual meeting via Zoom webinar software and is being audio recorded and simulcast on the Village's Facebook page. As a quorum of members is present via remote access, as required by law, I will ask for a roll call rather than voice votes on any agenda item requiring a vote. In accordance with the supplemental rule the board approved on April 16th, 2020, here's how public comment will be taken during this meeting. The email address and telephone number designated for public comment for this meeting are published with the meeting agenda. This time I would ask that Jordan Rogalski read the public comments received on non-agenda items that were submitted prior to the meeting. Public comments on agenda items, if any, will be read when we reach that item on the agenda. Jordan, were there any public comments?
No, we did not receive any tonight.
If a member of the public would like to submit a public comment during the meeting, please email your comment to glencoemeeting@villageofglencoe.org. Comments submitted during the meeting may be read at the end of the meeting. Written comments should be limited to 400 words. All right, now we can get started. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes from our last meeting on November 16th
So
and
moved.
18th?
Second.
Can I have a roll call, please?
Trustee Vree.
Yes.
Trustee Hallwax.
Yes.
Trustee Rubin.
Yes.
All right. Nikki, do you want to go through our monthly financial reports?
Yes, thank you, Trustee Vree. Good evening. Just a moment. Share my screen. Okay. For this evening's agenda, we'll be reviewing the December Treasurer's Report. All the numbers in this report are unaudited, so we will still see some year-end adjustments posted to these figures. And then we'll also be touching base on the Community Investment Program updates. We'll go over updates from December as well as the plan for 2022. And then lastly, we'll be reviewing the draft donation acceptance policy. Overall in December, it's just a continuation of what we've been seeing all year long. All of our revenues have been continuing to perform strong. Our property taxes ended the year at 97% of the budget. This is what we had expected and projected for the last couple of months, because we are seeing some refunds being debited from that property tax levy distribution by the county. There was a new law that was passed this year that may allow us to recoup some of that money. The county's anticipating that we might see as much as $250,000 extra in property tax revenue this year to make up for what we lost last year in property tax appeals. So that's something we'll keep an eye out. They did indicate that we might be able to see that distribution in November of this year. So it won't be right away, but it would be at the end of the year. On the income tax side and sales tax side, we're still, God bless you.
Excuse me, I can put it on mute, sorry.
It's okay. We are both higher than last year and closing out the year in excess of budget. Same with our permit revenue. We really saw that activity continue to remain fairly steady throughout the year. And then utility taxes are ending the year in excess of budget. We're also expecting to see some additional revenue, especially with this cold snap here recently, to see that number go a little bit higher. Our places for eating tax came in at 276% of budget. Admittedly, that budget was probably a little low. I think we just did not know what to expect. It was a brand new revenue this year. So we are hoping that our projection next year will be a little bit closer to what we can expect in terms of a target. On the water fund side, again, we've been kind of projecting this all year that our volumetric revenues hit 129% of budget. And that was really due to the dry summer that we had and all of the new meter infrastructure being in place. And then our fixed charge revenue was higher than last year, but just at 96% of budget. On the cash flow projection side, again, sales taxes are really a good news story. Now that we are starting to see that impact of the new legislation with destination sourcing of some of our online sales tax coming to Glencoe, we should be able to start charting the use tax and the sales tax together to see really what that impact was. But we are still seeing strong performance of our local businesses, which is a great news story coming out post-COVID.
Do you have detailed, not down to the actual businesses, but as far as business segments, do we have detailed information about where this is coming from?
We do. So all of our sectors are actually performing fairly strong. In the packet, let me see if I can find it quickly for you. The problem is the data is a little bit delayed because we're waiting on the state for it. Let me go. Oh, I'm in the wrong packet. 1 second.
I think it's page 23.
Thank you. I found it at the same time you did. Okay. Can you, this is probably really small. Oop. So you can kind of see.
Yeah, now I've got it too.
Sector by sector. In general, automotive and filling stations, it's mostly automotive, is really where we're seeing a big jump. This is quarter by quarter. But really across all sectors. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say the Wayfair ruling, I don't know how else to refer to it, but the online sales, does that show up within each of these sectors, or how does that show up?
It would show up in each of these sectors. We have the ability, and we haven't done so yet, but we do have the ability to drive into the line item detail and really find where that's coming from, because it could be anything from individualized retailers, like through Amazon. If it's sometimes when you buy things on Amazon, it's from a different retailer that's located out of state. So it could be Amazon purchases, it could be wine subscriptions, kind of a variety of things, anything that would be headquartered out of the state of Illinois, but we do have the ability to dig into that.
Would it be hard to just have actually a separate line for online sales? Doesn't even matter which sector, just whether it's outside of Glencoe or not?
We can try that for you.
I mean, if it's a ton of work, don't worry about it. It's not worth it, but
it's a good question. See how we can isolate it.
I think I'd be curious to just see what's happening locally versus what's just online sales.
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you. Okay. Just another note, a couple other notes on this slide. In terms of income tax, obviously this is ending the year higher than budget. However, as we've discussed at the committee level before, our income tax allocation is still shy of where it was originally. The legislators have cut this several times as part of their budget balancing process. So we are still trying to restore that. The Northwest Municipal Conference has taken this up on their legislative agenda and made this a main focus to help restore this back to where it was. They're currently looking for bill sponsors to take that forward. So that's something that we'll continue to watch closely because that's a significant revenue source for us. On the year as a whole, right now, we are projecting that revenue would exceed budgetary targets for the year of about $1.3 million. Some of that is due to some one-time revenue sources, and some of that is due to what we have seen all year long in terms of revenue performing very strong. Unaudited, we're looking at a general fund surplus of 1.2 million. Obviously, that's driven by strong revenue performance, but some of it is also capital projects that we delayed or got pushed into 2022. So again, I'd caution you that we are going to go through and do some year-end adjustments, and we do still have bills coming in for 2021 that will be charged back to that year. So we will present fully audited numbers once those are done and once we complete our year-end process. Whoops. Any questions on the treasurer's report? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Stella to go over the golf club financials.
Thank you, Nikki. So December, believe it or not, we did have rounds of golf played, pushing us to over 44,000 rounds this year, a new record, breaking last year's record. Just unbelievable amount of play this year. Our estimated NOI, which is not audited yet for 2021, is $592,000. Also a new record, breaking last year's record. Included in this is the fact that we spent $289,000 on capital expenditures. So that is a net number, that 592. It includes the expenditure of capital. So it was a phenomenal year for us this year. Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club update. We are currently working on a Glencoe Compass article that will be published in February. We did have an end of the year push for trying to match our anonymous matching grant. We started a Friends 500 Club, and we were able to close the gap on that $125,000 matching gift. We raised an additional $90,000. So currently the Friends fund balance is $212,000. We did not match the grant completely. Our donor did generously allow us to extend that matching grant period. So we are still pushing to meet the grant as soon as possible. But Friends is going along very well, and we're going to continue campaigning and trying to go and cultivate some relationships with some larger donors and possibly corporate sponsorship. And that's my report for December.
Do we have a goal? I don't remember, for Friends. I mean, obviously the goal is as much as possible, but is sort of a realistic of what we thought we could raise? I don't remember.
Our goal is $5 million for Friends.
Okay.
Thank you, Stella.
Sure.
Okay, moving on to the community investment program schedule, and I will turn this over to Assistant Finance Director Miller.
Thank you, Nikki. Good evening, everyone. The Community Investment Program schedule, the first schedule is on page 56 of your packet. This is an update, the final update for calendar year 2021. It shows the expenditures and highlighted in blue the changes for December. Some of the changes highlighted are completed projects, the sidewalk tractor, the Skokie Lagoon water main, and the golf cart path 2021 improvements. There are some projects that have been extended into the calendar year 2022 budget. Those are the engineering for the sanitary sewer improvements and the residential water meter, which Nikki referred to some of the projects being delayed. The second schedule in your packet for the community investment program is on page 57. This is the schedule for the 2022 projects and the anticipated timeline for when those will be coming to the board and also be completed. Are there any questions?
Okay. Thank you, Linda. Okay, moving right along here. The last item on the agenda is review of a draft donation acceptance policy. As this group may remember, during the calendar year 22 budget process, the village board directed staff to create a formal donation acceptance policy to be integrated with our financial policies. The purpose of the policy was to define donations that would be deemed acceptable to the village and outline the process to be followed if a donation was to be received. The village receives donations occasionally. It's really not an everyday process. Many of these are less than $100. Sometimes people donate food to public safety or public works. That's really not where we're going with this policy. This is really directed towards larger donations that may occur and really kind of kicked off during the budget process when we received a large donation for public safety. So the policy, the draft policy is included in the packet, and it's guided by and in line with the village ethics ordinance, which not only governs village staff, but also our elected officials and our volunteers. It defines prohibited sources of grants. So obviously or donations, obviously we would not be wanting to accept donations in a situation that would give the perception of any impropriety. It also provides for finance committee review if donations are complicated in nature or there's questionable circumstances surrounding it, and also provides a procedure for recording donations. Tonight, what we're seeking feedback from the committee on is just your general feedback on the draft policy as it stands. And then also if you'd like to add any additional limitations on employees or officers making donations, and officers of the village would be obviously members of the village board, any members of commissions, village commissions, volunteers, and so on. Or potentially a dollar threshold for the finance committee review, or if you'd like to further define anything in the policy, whether that's prohibited sources or specific uses for the donations. So at this time, I'm happy to take any questions on the policy or if you have any initial thoughts.
So for me, the important part, there's a couple things. The important part is the quote in the first paragraph, just conducting village business with integrity. So as long as, that's appropriately stressed. The other would be who is giving a donation. Now, just some regular person, okay, but what if it's an organization or something that, or somebody who the village, for whatever reason, doesn't want to be associated with? How do we make sure that, one of the great things about our board is the lack of partisanship, the lack of, call it agenda. And not that this veers into that, but you could see a way that it does. And, relying on outside sources when we don't always know what the motivations for those outside sources are can get precarious to me. So, that's my initial thought, is just sort of how do we make sure that it truly is an impartial donation, and then what do we do and how do we define who's an acceptable donee?
Jonathan, I was thinking the same in terms of should we have a I don't know if it needs to come to the board, but the staff should have some kind of process for accepting, because, you know, to your point, we wouldn't accept every donation, right, for that very reason. So I also think we would want to make it public that we got donations, and if it was from some organization or some, I guess from a anonymous person, I guess that's fine. But to your point, if it was from something not anonymous, we'd have to, I mean, that's exactly it, right? And we'd have to disclose that somewhere for the public.
A question that I know we were talking through, and Nikki included it on this slide, is, finance committee review of donations. Is there a dollar threshold that makes sense for all of you, or that you're comfortable with? I don't know that we had a number in mind. A number that comes to mind is $1,000. But I don't know why, other than it sounds like an even number. Nikki, one question related to that: the value of gifts to individuals is capped at $75 in our ethics ordinance. I don't know that a donation of $75 toward patriotic days or toward employee appreciation. Those are sometimes donations that the village will receive. I think probably they total less than $1,000 in an entire year. But is there, from the committee standpoint, a number that makes sense that would trigger a more significant review by the finance committee ultimately?
And Phil, if I could add on to that, because you make a great point. One of the things that we did try to carve out specifically in the policy would be any donations for a specific village sponsored event or cause. Like, for example, the donations that we did for the sesquicentennial events, or if we get donations for the holiday lighting events, something that would be village sponsored that we would be seeking donations for.
Or
obviously.
sponsorships.
Right.
Mhm.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
And the number that came to my head was more along the lines of $10,000, only because 1,000 just seems light, particularly because everything seems to cost a lot more money. But I think we're going to have to think through, if that's the appropriate amount. So sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
I mean, just two things: defining what's a donation and what's a sponsorship. If there's a way to do that. And then, as far as the size goes, how many donations do we get a year, just generally? Not including what you described, Phil, that if somebody who's at work does, but from residents.
The one that we got in 2021 is the only one that I can think of any size larger than $250 since I've been the village manager. It is very infrequent that we receive a donation. It's a cash donation or any sort of donation. So I think this is not a policy that we would employ frequently, but certainly, it begs the question: if we had another individual in the community or outside of the community indicate that they wanted to make a $50,000 donation or something of that nature to the village, this policy would be in place. But it is very infrequent, very infrequent.
Then what about the concert, like in Labor Day? I guess what would that be called? And then secondly, if we're able to have more events like that, which I think are really popular, even if we have the post bike race type tent without the bike race, and a local bank wanted to be the sponsor to pay for the tent or something. I mean, I'm not averse to
Yeah, I
that.
think we would separate those types of, to Trustee Vree's point, I think defining sponsorships and clarifying that in this policy would be important. I would say, especially in those cases, those are in some cases private resources or corporate resources going into public events that are open to the general public or subsidized for the general public. There are costs that the village incurs in many cases, if not all cases. Some of those costs are recouped by the village after an event is over, when we bill out for that. So I do think this is probably, it would be good for us to separate out sponsorship into its own category. And these would be different than that. This would be either unappropriated gifts for whatever purpose the village saw fit, or gifts for specific department operation, as we saw back in 2021, which triggered this discussion. But I think we would segregate out sponsorship.
I don't see why. The notion of a review is because we don't want to write a list, nor do we think we could, to say we would never take a nickel from that group or that human being because of reputation, because of what they stand for, because of what their political, social, whatever, their name your particular poison. And I'm not talking Republican, Democrat, et cetera. I'm talking about, extreme views. It's people that you would say the people in the village would be up in arms if they thought a particular group was, giving money to the village, and the village was keeping it and using it for whatever purpose.
And Trustee Rubin, that's a fair point. I'm not opposed to having a carve out for, and again, perhaps it's at a certain level of sponsorship for public events that the village would host, where we would run all of those past the finance committee. I think that's actually a great idea. Again, it has happened very infrequently. The only times that's come into play, aside from the Glencoe Live event last fall, related to some of the events surrounding the sesquicentennial celebration.
Yeah, we don't, excuse me, but we don't want to be the university that has to return a donation after the fact, because a particular donor that has made the news turns out to be a horrible human being. We'd at least like a chance to look at who's the sponsor giving us the money. We maybe have different financial criteria in terms of the minimum dollar amount, but all of this is going to happen, obviously, very, very infrequently. So whatever the group is comfortable with is fine. I don't think we're going to be overburdened setting the number lower, like $1,000 for a gift and whatever it is, $5,000 or, to Joe's point, $10,000 for sponsorship. But we ought to treat this. We ought to treat these extraordinary outside source gifts, donations, sponsorships the same.
I agree with that. I do think there's a difference between the two. Not that we ought to treat them differently in terms of the review process, but the idea of a sponsorship where you're kind of selling something. There's you get, it's advertising. Versus a donation where if somebody's giving a car to public safety, we're not going to put their name on it. So just the idea that they are different, and we do occasionally solicit sponsorship, call it donate, that type of a donation, versus we generally don't solicit donations for other things, and I don't want to go down that path for the most. I mean, I guess we're doing it for the golf club, but I certainly don't want to have to start financing our public safety or something like that through donations. So anyway, so the idea
I
that they are
agree.
yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, like, I think we can define them both in this while saying we treat them the same. Just that, so it.
But if you're asking, if you're going to go out and say, I want sponsorship, it's one thing to go to people that you've already thought about and said, would you please? We think you'd be a good sponsor, or we'd love it if you would sponsor. You know, hopefully somebody's done a little vetting before that. Versus somebody shows up and says, oh, I understand you're raising money for the such and such event. Here's a check. I'll take column A, you know, which gives me whatever, this kind of advertising for it. Here's my money. It's as good as anybody else's. And I want the right to say, no, your money, we don't want your money.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly appropriate. I think, you know, it may be better for us to go back and see if we can find any examples of dollar thresholds from that standpoint. I will say, I believe, you know, when we did Light the Lights for the sesquicentennial years in 18 and 19, you know, there was a project budget overall for those two events that hovered somewhere in the $15,000 range. There was different levels of sponsorship that were developed as kind of a sponsorship package, and your company or in some cases families were donating based off of those levels. I think that's an easy thing for us to use as kind of a threshold or framework for bringing that type of thing to the finance committee just on a monthly basis, especially if with public events or things like that, we're seeking sponsors. That's not a difficult step for us to take in the process. So we'll put something like that together.
Could I say, I want to reiterate, I am grateful. I think the village is grateful for this, you know, anonymous gift that went to public safety. It was a lot of money. And, you know, I'm grateful, and nothing wrong happened there. The possibility of a problem with donations, you know, one possible problem is someone is buying access or, you know, arguably buying a particular public policy, and we have to be careful about that. Another is it's somebody that we think is, you know, unsavory, and we would not want to take their money. There's no difference between a donation and a sponsorship really for either of those. With the sponsorship, if it's unsolicited, so I agree with Gary that we don't want to. I would not distinguish particularly between a donation and a sponsorship because the risks are the same, but I think the risks are low and will be infrequent. I think if we said whatever we get, if, you know, there's always the ability to say, no, we don't want it. I mean, you could get $10, and if somebody noticed it and it was from the American Nazi Party, we could say, yeah, no, thanks. But I think there should be a threshold at which we'll look at the finance committee. I think the number $1,000 is a good number because it'll exclude almost everything, but pick up something that's kind of big. So I think 1,000's a good number. And I don't know that we need a huge number of guidelines as to how we're going to make these decisions. I feel we could be guided by what was not particularly heralded back in the day, but looks better now when you compare it to the current Supreme Court. When Potter Stewart said about pornography, I know it when I see it. And you know,
I was thinking of the same quote.
As was I.
The finance committee, you know, we'll all know when something smells like a dead fish, and we'll know to do something about it. And we'll all know when it's totally okay, as this last large gift was. So I mean, if somebody knows about guidelines and can put them all together, that'd be great. But I have a feeling that we're going to be trying really hard, trying to figure out some hypothetical when we might do better to apply the Potter-Stewart rule.
Yeah, I don't know that we would recommend further guidelines than even perhaps what we've already included in the draft policy that Nikki's developed. I think there is the question of whether the policy needs to define a specific use for a donation. I don't know that it does. I think that could be determined and should be determined by the elected officials at that time, who have reviewed the donation in line with the acceptance policies. So I don't know that short of having a threshold, which I do think is important in the policy, that there needs to be a flow chart of if this then that that gets included in there. I think to your point, President Rowan, that's going to be what this body does, which is to review it and ask questions and make the determination based off of what they hear, see, and are presented with. So if you all are generally comfortable with the language in the policy, we can tweak it in a couple of spots, update it, make sure we're including a section on sponsorship for village events, and bring something back to you next month to take a look at again. If that works.
Sounds good.
Seeing
That'd be
nodding. Okay, great.
Okay, sounds like we have direction. Thank you.
All very helpful comments. Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
All right. Jordan, were there any public comments during the meeting?
No, we did not receive any.
Any questions or anything anybody else would like to bring up? All right. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
Wait,
So
real,
moved.
can I just real quick, Trustee V, just want to ask something. I talked to Phil about this a little bit and then Stella yesterday at our meeting. I guess what I'm getting concerned about, and like everybody else, is inflation, and then also staffing. I think everybody's seeing it at their own organizations. Everyone's seeing it all over. So I don't know if it's for today, since we're wrapping up, but I would think staff and the finance committee should have a thought about, is this year going to look different in a more expensive way, and what are their staffing challenges going to be in 2022? Maybe some worst case scenarios, maybe some projects we might need to get stack ranked in terms of things that might have to get reconsidered. I don't know. It's just something that doesn't seem to be going away. If anything, it seems to be getting worse.
Yeah, we can talk about that now if we wanted, or we could do that next time. I think we've sort of brought it up through budgeting, and I think it's something that we need to incorporate into budgeting. I suppose since the 2022 budget's already done.
I mean, yeah, to some degree, the impact of staff, the impact of staff costs are baked in early on. When we talk about cost of living adjustments, or we talk about insurance costs, those are all things that we generally know what we're going to see. I think what Trustee Hallwax, you may be referencing is turnover, the increasing difficulty in finding hourly employees, whether that's at the Public Works Department, whether that's in the golf course operations, and kind of the upward pressure on some of those hourly wages. We have ranges for all of our part-time employees that are kind of approved as a component of the budget in the staffing section. And there have been, we have certainly seen in the last year or two, starting ranges in some of those hourly salaries for temporary and seasonal employees starting higher than we had in the past, because it's harder to find those people. I think the other areas of cost relate to training, recruitment, and getting people up to speed during the course of some turnover. And so that's, people who are left behind during turnover, people who are replacing the person who left. There's definitely overtime costs that come into play in departments like Public Works and Public Safety and Golf, where if there are fewer people to do the same amount of work, those fewer people are working more. And we budgeted this year for an increase in overtime costs in public safety, with a full understanding that that department is going to be moving through a transition period for at least this year and further. I would say in the immediate sense, we don't have at the staff level a significant concern that what we have allocated in the 2022 budget isn't going to meet the needs of the village's organization. Now, what I would say is, as we go through the course of the year, we could perhaps on a quarterly basis, and Nikki, you and I can talk about how to present this, talk a bit about where things stand from the standpoint of recruitment, turnover, expected or unexpected resignations and retirements, and where some of that may be impacting the operations. Budgetarily, it's probably going to be relatively de minimis in the course of the current year. I think the question also is, what does it look like next year, 5 years from now? And that becomes a little bit harder to project out. Inflation at 7%, none of us really remember. So I think if that's got staying power, we are going to have some different conversations 6 months from now. If it starts to regulate and dip a bit, that impact may be less severe. So, and I've said a lot there, but I agree that there is value, I think, in a regular check-in on where things stand. We've got 6 open recruitments right now. Some of those relate to new positions that were approved in this budget, but some of them relate to turnover. And I'll tell you, recruitment is harder than it used to be. It's a smaller pool with hungrier employers. And so we are seeing pressure from that standpoint. Glencoe has always struggled to some degree because of where we're located. It's harder to get here from wherever you are. But we're, as the board and the committees are well aware, last year, the approval of a couple of staff policy changes, the remote work and flex scheduling policy, and our family leave policy that went into place last April. We're using those as recruitment tools. And I'll tell you, we are ahead of the pack, at least in local government, by having those codified and that we're able to use that as a recruitment tool. It is meaningful that we accommodate for certain positions remote work. It is meaningful. But as Trustee Hallwax, you and I talked about, not every position is eligible for that. And so as the organization shifts and changes, I think that's going to be just our ongoing challenge to remain competitive. It's hard to sell a sense of what it's like working here until you kind of have the chance to talk to people. But one of the things that we're working on as well in our recruitment materials is, talking about what kind of an organization we are, what's important to us as individuals and as a group, what's important, what's the village's mission, and why that should speak to you if you want to work for us. That sounds like not that surprising unless you start thinking about how government has done recruitment over the last 50 years. That kind of thing generally is pretty cutting edge. So I would love to provide you guys regular updates on where things stand with those, with our employees and recruitment and that type of thing. And Nikki and I can talk about how to integrate that into the report. Again, I think on a quarterly basis probably is going to be frequent enough.
Yeah, I mean, Phil, for me, I don't want to give anybody more work. I think what we'd be interested in is trends, right? If we're losing staff at the hourly level, we're having to replace them with, we've seen 3 or 4 that we've had to replace at 10% more, 20% more, whatever it is, or we're struggling to fill jobs here, right? The one-off, I'm sure, is way too much work for you guys. But when you're seeing something worth noting, I think, for the next year, it's worth us understanding. And
Yeah,
it's hopefully this anomaly is gone in a year, but for next year, it looks like I certainly am concerned about how you're going to be able to staff accordingly.
Yeah, we can definitely look into that. That's great information, and I think we welcome the conversation.
Sorry, Trustee V, to push this 5 more minutes.
That's just fine.
Still get a gold star for a very pithy meeting.
Anything else for anyone, from anyone? All right, hearing none, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Second.
Roll call, Phil, please.
Trustee Bree,
Yes,
Trustee Hallwax,
Yes.
Trustee Rubin.
Yes.
we are adjourned. Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
you.
Be well.